Hello and welcome to Man's Model Moments. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Hawker P.1127 from Airfix, which is another vintage classic in 1/72nd scale, and it's probably going to set off alarm bells somewhere at Hornby after my rather scathing build review of the Belvedere. I'll link that one here if you've not seen it yet. Now the first negative is that this comes in an end opening box, so we have to slide out the contents from one end. Now we get the new cartograph decals and the usual instructions that we'll take a look at shortly. We then have the relatively small bag of plastic, which does have the transparency safely bagged within it as usual. On examination of the bag, however, I found mine wasn't properly sealed, which is not a good sign, especially with an end opening box. As we will see later, I was lucky here, but it's just another reminder of Airfix's continuous QC issues. Moving to the instructions, we have the standard Airfix A4 booklet, this one being a single folded A3 sheet. The outer cover and inner page give us the standard title, a little bit of history, and then all the assembly instructions and icons with the usual multilingual support. The next two pages are a bit more involved, and very much a throwback to the 1960s method of exploded diagrams with a lot going on in each. Step 1, for example, has us put together 15 of the 37 included parts. That's over 40% of the total parts, which includes optional extras. Despite that, you can see that this is quite a straightforward kit, with a number of simplifications that you'd expect in this age of tooling, the original coming out in 1963, when my father was a teenager and probably making this back then. Even so, there are a few optional parts here for the nose and tail boom, and the kit can also be built with wheels up or in flight, though there's no flight stand supplied, which is a shame, and I'll come back to that later. Now, probably in order to save costs, Airfix has given us the scheme on the rear of the box here too, but to be fair, it's such a simple one that this is really more of a decal placement guide than anything else, since there are only a few gunmetal areas called out to break up the overall silver of these prototypes. The decal sheet is, as we now expect from Airfix, being a super crisp and well printed cartograph set with excellent colour density and registry. You get roundels, registration numbers, and a few other markings associated with some of the testing models, but once again, more on that later. The sprues, I don't really think these qualify as frames, start off in the most basic way with the starboard fuselage and upper wings, which are, of course, covered in raised rivets and feature no internal detail. The port side and lower wings are pretty much identical, though the casting on all of these is commendably clean. The first of what we might call an actual frame has the pilot and the internal engine intake fan, with most of the rest of the frame given over to internal parts and undercarriage components, including the wing tip stabilisers. The last two sprues contain the horizontal stabilisers and other items, the most impressive of which are the engine nozzles, which don't look bad at all for their age, despite being solid one-piece items, and these were a pleasant surprise. You also have the optional in-flight wingtips and the long pointed nose of the prototype with its thin tip. The last part is the one-piece canopy, which is protected within its own little plastic bag. Freeing it from this plastic prison, we can see it is moulded in crystal clear plastic, but it is very thick, and its heavy curves, together with that volume of plastic, means some pretty big optical distortion when looking through it. That's really to be expected though, and it's certainly going to be better than an old eBay kit version of this. Okay, let's build this little bird. The first thing to do is put the blanking plates in the fuselage. These do have pin ejector marks, but you can't see them, so I'm not bothering cleaning these up. Next are the engine nozzle attachment pins, and as I'm not 10 anymore, I don't care about these moving, so I'm just cementing these in place, and they all fit nicely. With this done, we can bring in the intake fan for the Pegasus engine. Having repeated most of this for the port fuselage section 2, we can now bring these two halves together. As you can see, this is a pretty painless process, the parts fitting well and presenting no issues in going together. There is definitely a seam line, but most 61-year-olds have some signs of age, so I don't think there's much to complain about here. Now the blanking plates we put inside don't really do their job and are horribly inaccurate, and my port intake was also a tiny bit short shot, but we'll come to these areas later on. Once I was convinced everything was going to stay more or less where I put it, I moved on to put the ejection seat in. Of course, this is the most basic representation of this possible, but as I was just going to spray everything inside black and not worry about it, all I wanted to do here was ensure the seat was going to fit centrally within the fuselage, which is why I didn't glue it to one half before. After test fitting and a little cleanup, this went in with some more extra thin and the fuselage could be set aside to dry. Now I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have supported me directly through YouTube memberships and Patreon. This really does keep the channel going, and without you it would be very difficult for me to be able to continue doing this. Now if you're only just seeing your name on here for the first time, it's because I update this monthly, and if I've prepared some videos ahead of time, then there may still have the old list on, even if the list has been updated since then. Don't worry though, your name will get on the list and will continue to appear throughout your support. If you are considering supporting me, YouTube channel membership is by far the easiest way to do this, since Patreon is becoming a more challenging platform to engage with. Whichever you choose, however, I absolutely appreciate your contributions, and don't forget to come and check out the private members Discord, which you get access to at any level. The very simple two-piece wings come next, and though the trailing edges are very thick, they come together with no issues. These can then be brought onto the fuselage, which you can see I've roughly scraped the joining seam on. Once again, they attach without any problems, though there is a bit of an issue which I'm sure many of you will have spotted here. Don't worry, I'll get to that. Horizontal stabilisers were more of an issue, however. Despite them being moulded so that they slot into one another to help with fitment and angle, in practice this meant that one popped out the other when you put it in, and they would sit at different angles. Nevertheless, perseverance and a lot of extra thin eventually got them seated and secure. The odd cylindrical tail boom goes on next, which had quite a lot of flash on it, but it actually has a much larger issue. It's just too wide. I'll deal with this later, but you're better off replacing this with some appropriately sized plastic tubing. The nose goes on without obvious issue, but again, I'll return to this one. Here I'm showing the canopy in macro view to highlight one of its issues. This big casting lip, which prevents it seating. I'm not sure if this is really thick flash or something else, but it needs removing regardless. Here's another view after I've removed the left-hand side lip. And then some brisk sanding of the part is also needed to get it to sit flat with no gaps on the fuselage. Unfortunately, that highlights another obvious issue with this part. It's just too wide, by at least a millimetre or so. In fact, being the wrong size is a common problem in areas of this kit. The nose also suffers this issue, as well as the tail boom that I mentioned earlier. And another issue with the kit are the wing roots. The fuselage mating points are too short, giving it a shark tooth where they meet. Before tackling all of that though, I move to the engine nozzles, which do need some cleanup that's easiest started whilst they're still attached to the sprues. They do clean up nicely though, and once again, for the moulding technology of the time, these are really quite good. The undercarriage parts are not quite as nice, and feature a plethora of pieces to sort out. Ejector pin marks, flash, erroneous plastic pieces, and so on. This is all par for the course for a kit of its age, but they do take time and effort to address. Some of you may want to replace these. Likewise, the fit of these parts is terrible. The hub on the main wheels is cavernous compared to the axle, meaning they just fall off while placing them. And will lie at an angle when cemented, since there's nothing supporting them. As such, I turn to my old faithful, sprue glue, to solve my issues. For the main landing gear, I just use some medium thickness on the main axle to support the wheel. The nice thing about this is that it both supports and cements the part, making it a stronger assembly overall as well. And yes, I then attacked my poor kit with copious amounts more of the green gloop, specifically building up the nose to blend it in and avoid the shrew-like downwards curve, filling in the central joint seam, those wing roots and joins to blend everything in, and the rear boom to minimise the obvious size differential. Underneath, I likewise addressed the seam, the gaps in the wing joint, and I also filled in that slight casting short shot on the intake. I didn't build up the intake baffles with sprue glue, but I'll come back to these in a second. And here's the result after a lot of sanding, more filling, rinsing and repeating. The main join is now more or less seamless, as are the wings along with the blended roots. The tail boom is blended, but it still looks odd, hence replacement being the best option. The front nose is blended in, and as we can see from the side, now features the straight profile it should have. You can also see I've filled those blanking plates here with plasticard, and blended them in with filler. The seams underneath are also smooth, so I could move on to giving the whole thing a coat of primer just to check everything out. Not quite dry, but an overall coat of matte black just to highlight any problems. Don't worry, it's not supposed to be even, I just wanted to check for lumps and bumps. Speaking of those, we need to put some more of our own on, starting with the engine nozzles, which go on without any problems, which is nice at this stage in the build. And here she is with all of those pieces: the wingtip stabilisers, engine nozzles, undercarriage, and their respective doors. With all of those on, we can give everything another good coat of matte black primer and put the canopy on. Which is where we are here, and you can see our canopy is mounted pretty well, but as you can see from the side, it's got a prominent overhang. I'm not going to deal with that at all, I'm just going to ignore it and mask it up. The good news is that masking the canopy isn't difficult, though where to do that at the back is a bit vague. The prominent framing would allow you to blend this in more if you want to put that work in, but this isn't that kind of review. Instead, I sprayed, decaled and detail painted it ready for the final shots. And here she is. After being so harsh on the Belvedere, I did get a bunch of people trying to defend it for being a product for its time, or it being ideal for kids, or saying that I wasn't a real modeller if I couldn't make a garbage kit into a work of art, or some other such nonsense. I expect those people will expect me to be similarly harsh here, because they seem to think I'm attacking their generation, or some strange ideal, or Airfix because they're British, which is also utter nonsense. Well, newsflash, I just give you my honest and reasoned opinion and view of the kits I look at, and the Belvedere is just a terrible kit, which I evidence by not only looking at, but by building it. It doesn't fit well, it has awful detail, it isn't fun to make, and it costs more than a Tamiya 1/72nd scale Mosquito. This kit, on the other hand, actually does fit together well for the most part. It doesn't have much in the way of detail, but then it's not got the big exposed cockpit and rotor assemblies of the Belvedere, so you can't really see where it's lacking. I also found it was quite a fun little thing to put together, and, unlike the Belvedere, if you're an 8-year-old unconcerned with any of the accuracy or detail issues anyway, it would absolutely be a fun little thing to make and fly around. It's also got a pocket money price. This kit is $6.99 RRP. I sell it for just £6 in my shop, so it's worth a punt for most. As I have hopefully shown, any modeller with basic skills can make this into a serviceable facsimile, and because there were a number of small modifications to these prototypes, you could actually use it for the basis of a number of different airframes, or even a Kestrel. In short, I think this is really what the Airfix Vintage Classic should be: affordable and interesting. This kit is not just for those who built it back in the day, I certainly didn't, but for those who want a small taste of the past without too much bitterness. Now I will put a few small caveats to this. Firstly, do your research. The supply decals, for instance, aren't accurate for the actual representation of the aircraft included. The black and white and thrust angle markings appeared at different times, for instance, so bear that in mind that these were test beds and there were frequent and numerous changes to them. Secondly, I actually think that this kit would have worked in a couple of different ways. It actually would make a fair vintage classic starter kit, with a flight stand and a couple of paints. It really only needs silver, gunmetal and black after all. It goes together well, and accuracy doesn't really concern a younger builder enough for anything to be a real problem here. I think it would have also worked at a higher price point, with a proper box and a new two-piece canopy for those builders who want to replace the undercarriage and cockpit with aftermarket items and make a proper job of this. Sell that for $9.99 and I couldn't see many modelers complaining, especially if they could buy the cheapest starter set as an alternative. Anyway, we have what we have, and I don't think it's at all bad. Certainly worth the price of admission. I would happily build this again and look at putting in a proper cockpit, replacing the canopy and undercarriage, and giving it a proper multi-panel metal finish, though I just need to find the extra time to do so. As such, I'm happy to recommend this little aerobatic marvel, and I think it'll provide an interesting juxtaposition to the Harrier that it was of course the ancestor to. That's all for this instalment of Man's Model Moments. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more like it, and share this video with others you think would also enjoy it. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and if you're feeling generous then I also have a Patreon, which is absolutely the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like this. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.